As luck would have it, I was just finishing up making a video about what made the current MPC hardware a must-have for any studio, and then bam! Out of nowhere, Akai drops yet another massive upgrade to their firmware. Once again, redefining what their standalone Groovebox is capable of and, in my opinion, setting the MPC lineage even further apart from the rest of the competition. That's why in this video, I'm not just going to go over some of the new features included in the latest update, but I'm also going to give you an overview about how this and previous updates have continuously and progressively made the MPC just a must-have in your studio. Here's why you need, and yes, I said need, an MPC in your music making arsenal. Hi, welcome to the Midlife Synthesist. Let's get started. Remember this video? If you haven't seen it yet, a few weeks ago I ranked all of the gear that I own, and the MPC-X came out on top as the #1 music making box that I would take with me to a desert island. Many of you were very surprised by that choice, but for all the naysayers out there, I really have to say, I'm sorry, but especially after the 2.10 firmware update, I stand firmly by my decision. Now, before I start, I'd just like to say that I am in no way connected to or sponsored by Akai. Why is that, Akai? I would love to be sponsored by you. Also, if you want an in-depth review of all the features in the new firmware, there are other channels who have already covered this beautifully and extensively, especially Akai's own Andy Mack, who is just one of the coolest people and product demoers I know of. I'll link some of my favorite videos down below so you can check them out. Here are just a few reasons why the MPC should definitely be a part of your studio. Number 1, paradigm shifting free firmware updates. A powerful reason to get the MPC nowadays is that it's a platform that is still very much in active development, and it just keeps getting better and better with each new firmware update. Funny thing is, I wrote that line before they even dropped the 2.10 firmware this week. In this last firmware update, it honestly feels like they just gave us an entirely new instrument to play around with. And it's not even the first time that they've done this. If you don't know much about the update, I'll try to give you an idea. They gave us 4 new virtual instruments, loads of new effects, including a voice harmonizer / doubler / tuner, made huge improvements to the drum key group engine, and to top things off, you can now connect an audio interface to the MPC via USB to expand it up to 32 audio ins and outs. That's friggin' nuts! I do think that a big reason for all these amazing updates and why we could expect there to be much more to come in the future is that the competition in the Groovebox niche is pretty fierce. And right now the MPC has to compete with things like the 1010 Black Box, the Novation Circuit, the Deluge, the OP1, and especially with the launch of the very gas-inducing Machine Plus. Nowadays, the MPC versus Machine argument feels strangely familiar to the PlayStation versus Xbox feud. I'd really love to know how you feel about this ongoing debate, and would really appreciate if you left a comment below with your opinion on who you think is currently winning the beatbox race. At least for my part, I can testify that since those early days when I was just starting out with my MPC Live, up until today with my X, I've seen way more updates than I was ever expecting to, and at least 3 of those added features that completely transformed the MPC's place in my studio and what I use it for, and 2.10 might perhaps be the biggest one yet. Audio in and out expandability. As I mentioned earlier, in the latest update, the MPC is now capable of hooking up to an audio interface and expand its audio outputs up to 32 audio ins and outs. This takes the MPC straight into DAW territory, not only being able to control your external synths through MIDI, but also to be able to mix and record them in real time as well. There are other huge practical benefits to using this feature when just using the MPC as a sampler too. If you've seen my video on the Zoom L12, you know that I was really hyped to be able to hook up my synths to my samplers using the many headphone outputs available in the mixer. I did have a few concerns, however, as to the sound quality and signal levels when using these outputs when sampling. Now, with MPC's new audio interface integration, I can literally have all of my synths connected to it at all times for fast and easy sampling without having to worry about reconnecting and rewiring physical cables. Another way that this feature really changes things is how it affects the choice between buying the MPC 1, Live, or X. Now that the number of audio ins and outs is potentially a non-issue, as well as being able to expand its MIDI connectivity using a USB hub, choosing your MPC could potentially just come down to budget, form factor, the need for internal storage, battery, or if you really want more knobs and buttons. Akai really performed a small miracle here, making it so whatever MPC you choose will basically have the same functionality as all the others. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you could take a second to click that like button and leave me a comment down below on how I can make these better for you. Thanks. Multi-MIDI. This is a feature that synth owners had been asking for a while when it just came out. Not only can you sync and control all of your synths with the MPC via MIDI, but with the ability to hook up the USB hub to further expand your USB ports in any of the models, this feature turns the MPC into a synth sequencing powerhouse. With a huge range of MIDI sync and control options, MPCs really are the very definition of flexible and versatile, easily making them a prime choice to be the brains of your synth studio. Background recording. Time and time again, a feature that makes itself handier each time that I remember to make use of it is the ability to recall MIDI notes that you played when you were not actually recording anything. This is similar to Ableton's performance capture feature. Let's say you're happily jamming along to your track and you're trying to get a feel for a bass line. You unexpectedly hit a couple of notes by accident that happen to sound awesome. As many of us painfully know, you may stumble upon the greatest musical idea when you're just playing around, but the moment you press that record button, you can go absolutely blank, as well as suffer from a complete loss of all of your fine motor skills. In another situation, you might lose that idea or not be able to recall it just as it was. However, on the MPC, with just a button press, the notes will magically reappear on your MIDI grid and you can further perfect and tweak your sequence. To have this feature available in a hardware device is just crazy, and it's also a great incentive to just go with the flow and try new things when you're composing or jamming, without the fear of not being able to record your happy accident later on. Lazy chopping and adding tails. If you're not familiar with lazy chopping, it's basically the best thing since sliced bread. In most samplers, if you want to chop up your samples into usable slices, it can be a bit tedious to set up the start and end points. In some cases, you don't even get a visual reference. I'm talking to you, SP404. However, in the MPC, this has been made streamlined into a very fast and intuitive process. You simply tap the pads as the sample plays through and assign the slices to the pads as you go. Afterwards, you can fine-tune the start and end points and then convert it into a program. It's one of those little things that might seem simple, but makes your life just that much easier and your production that much faster. Also, in the latest 2.10 update, the MPC now has an extremely new useful feature that adds a small tail to your sample by making something like a micro loop out of the last milliseconds of your sample. That way, your samples now trail off organically instead of in an abrupt silence or a click. In actual use, this small feature really adds up to make your tracks feel that much more polished and professional. Standalone virtual instruments and effects. If there is one thing that really sets Native Instruments Machine Plus apart from the competition, it's its wonderful virtual instruments and effects. After all, that is pretty much Native Instruments' playground. And no, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Akai are at that level yet, but I will tell you that the MPC now, more than ever, has a very solid roster of virtual instruments and effects to help you along with your music production. I'm especially in love with the new Mellotron and Hype Synth. I really wasn't expecting them to be this good, to be honest, but in the few days since I've been playing around with them, I can definitely see them becoming as staples in my music production. Also, I'm willing to bet that anyone who has ever taken a hardcore sampler like the Digitact or the SP4 outside of their studio to play around on your lunch break or out on a vacation has probably been in the situation where you found yourself needing a proper synth engine to complete that one missing piece of your track. However, if you're now rocking an MPC-1 or live on your travels, you can pretty much write an entire album on this thing alone. With regards to the effects, they have only gotten better and more varied with each new firmware update. And in this latest one, I think they really nailed it, especially with the new stutter and granulator, my favorites on the MPC so far. Pad Perform. If you happen to own an MPC a few years ago, maybe you too would have looked with envy at machine users who had that great and integrated scale mode available to them at all times. We instead had a nerfed and almost useless version of that in our MPCs, but no more. In a previous firmware update, Akai made things right and included a Pad Perform feature that was, and still is in my opinion, a true game changer in terms of what the MPC can do for music making both in the studio and for live use. The pads have always been awesome when playing around with your samples, but being able to use them in a predefined musical scale with your internal or external synths can really open up your creativity and improvisational skills. This feature is especially useful for those who are just starting out or maybe are a bit rusty or lacking in the musical theory department, and it makes life much easier and fun, as well as boosting your confidence, both in a band or maybe in a live situation. Splice Integration. Even with all its new bells and whistles, the MPC will always be, first and foremost, a sampler. If you're into sampling, you've probably heard about Splice, or maybe you even have a paid subscription. If you haven't, it's a paid sample library with everything ranging from drum one-shots to full-blown loops. The cool thing about MPCs is that you can sync them up with your Splice account for easy access to your safe samples. I found it to be really useful to be able to search for samples on my cell phone during my downtime, and then when I fire up my MPC, it'll just automatically sync up and download all the samples that I found during the day. In closing, 30 years ago, Akai and Roger Lin managed to capture lightning in a bottle with the launch of their now legendary MPC 60, and I'm very happy to say that it's as electrifying now as it ever was. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful, or at least entertaining. Have a great week. I'll see you in the next one.